I am a carpenter, not normal.
To understand how I got here, standing on the red Georgia clay of a farm that had been in my family for 4 generations, while my own brother called me a trespasser. You have to understand the kind of man my father, Elias Thorne, was. He was a man of his word, a man of the soil, and a man who believed that sweat equity was the only currency that mattered. I had spent 20 years sweating for him, running the Thorne custom furniture shop out of our barn, while my younger brother Julian was off in Atlanta, wearing silk ties and spending money he hadn't earned. The betrayal didn't happen all at once. It was a slow-motion car wreck that started the day we buried Dad. We were standing under the weeping willows at the edge of the property, the humidity thick enough to choke a horse, when Julian leaned over and whispered that we needed to talk about the disposition of assets. I thought he meant dividing up the old man's personal effects, the pocket watches, and the fishing gear. I didn't realize he meant the very ground I was standing on. 2 days later, a lower I'd never met named Henderson showed up at the farmhouse. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table I built with my own hands, and read a document that made my blood run cold. It claimed that Dad had changed his will 3 weeks before he died, leaving the entire 300-acre estate and the business to Julian and his business partner, a local contractor named Marcus Vane. I sat there, my hands stained with walnut oil and sawdust, staring at a signature that looked like my father's but felt like a lie. Dad had always promised me the shop and the north 80 acres. He knew I loved this land. Julian hated it. Julian called it the dirt pit. But there it was, on official paper. Julian stood in the corner of the kitchen, looking out at the barn with a predatory glint in his eyes. He wasn't seeing a legacy. He was seeing a subdivision. He was seeing dollar signs and asphalt. He didn't even look at me when he said I had 30 days to vacate the premises. On his way out, he paused by Dad's old leather recliner, the one worn smooth by 40 years of evening reading. He wrinkled his nose and told Henderson, "Have someone haul this thing to the dump. It reeks." That chair still held the shape of my father's back. Julian saw garbage. The realization hit me like a physical blow when I went to the back of the workshop that evening. I was looking for a specific set of chisels when I saw Marcus Vane's truck parked by the old creek bridge. He and Julian were walking the perimeter with a surveyor's tape. They weren't mourning. They were measuring. I realized then that this wasn't just a change of heart from a dying man. This was a heist. I went back to the house, my heart hammering against my ribs, and started looking through Dad's things. I needed to find something, anything, that proved what I knew in my soul. That's when I picked up the cedar jewelry box. It was a small piece, something Dad had carved for Mom back in the 50s. It had a false bottom, a secret I'd discovered when I was 10 years old. I pressed the hidden catch, expecting to find Mom's old pearls. Instead, I found a single sheet of paper, handwritten and dated only 5 days before he passed. It was a letter to me, detailing how Julian had been pressuring him to sign papers he didn't understand, and how he had hidden his true final wishes with the only person in Oakhaven who still remembers what honor looks like. He didn't name the person, but he mentioned the blue ink of justice. I felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly doused by the cold reality of the situation. Julian had the legal document. He had the high-priced liar. He had Marcus Vane, a man known for greasing the wheels at the county seat. I was just a carpenter with a letter that might not even hold up in court. As I stood there in the darkening hallway, holding that cedar box, I heard Julian's voice from the porch, laughing about how they were going to bulldoze the barn first. The barn I'd spent my life in. The barn where I'd carved every piece of furniture that paid for Julian's fancy college tuition. The lowest point came a week later. I was sitting on the porch steps, watching the sunset, when the sheriff pulled up. He was a man I'd gone to school with, but he wouldn't look me in the eye. He handed me an injunction. Julian had filed a restraining order, claiming I was unstable and threatening the integrity of the estate. I had to leave right then. Not in 30 days. Now, I had to pack what I could fit in my truck and get out. As I threw my clothes into a duffel bag, I looked at the empty space on the wall where our family photo used to hang. Julian had already taken it down. I felt a hollow ache in my chest that made it hard to breathe. I walked out to the truck, the cedar box tucked under my arm, and looked back at the house. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I was 59 years old, and I was being evicted by my own blood. I hit the steering wheel until my knuckles bled, the silence of the Georgia night mocking me. In that moment of absolute despair, as I sat in the cab of my truck with nowhere to go, I closed my eyes, and I could almost smell the sweet scent of pine shavings in the shop. I heard my father's voice, clear as a bell, whispering just one thing. "Stand tall, Silas." The suffering that followed was a slow, grinding misery. I moved into a rusted-out Fleetwood trailer on the edge of the county line, a place that smelled of damp wool and old cigarettes. It was a far cry from the cedar-scented halls of the farmhouse. Every morning, I woke up to the sound of the highway instead of the birds in the orchard. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the way the town turned on me. Oakhaven is a small place, and Julian had been busy. He hadn't just taken the land. He was taking my reputation. I walked into Gable's Diner a few days after I moved. It was the place where I'd had breakfast every morning for 30 years. Usually, the air was full of, "Hey, Silas," and "How's the oak coming along?" That morning, the room went dead silent. Mrs. Gable, who had seen me grow up, didn't even bring me coffee. She just stood behind the counter, wiping the same spot over and over. When I finally caught her eye, she looked away. I heard a whisper from the booth behind me, something about elder abuse and trying to swindle his own brother. Julian had told everyone that I'd been stealing from Dad's accounts for years, and that the new will was Dad's way of protecting the family legacy from my greed. He'd painted himself as the savior coming home to fix the mess I'd made. I stood up, my breakfast untouched, and walked out. The humiliation was a hot brand on my skin. I went to the hardware store to pick up some basic supplies, and the owner, a man I'd known since Little League, told me he couldn't extend me credit anymore. He said it was just business, but the way he gripped the counter told me he'd bought Julian's story hook, line, and sinker. Isolation is a heavy thing. It's not just being alone. It's being erased. I spent weeks in that trailer, watching the rain turn the red clay into a swamp. I'd see Marcus Vane's trucks rumbling down the road toward the farm, loaded with demolition equipment. Every time a truck passed, it felt like a shovel full of dirt on my grave. I stopped going into town. I stopped answering the phone. I became a hermit, a cautionary tale for the gossips at the post office. I'd sit in the dark, clutching that cedar jewelry box, the only thing I had left of my real life. One night, the power went out in the trailer. I sat there in the sweltering heat, the mosquitoes buzzing against the screen door, and I realized how close I was to breaking. I had lost my home, my livelihood, my family, and my name. I looked at my hands in the moonlight, the hands of a master craftsman, and they were shaking. I felt a deep, cold anger starting to replace the sorrow. It wasn't a loud anger. It was the kind of heat that hardened steel. I realized that Julian thought he had won because he had the paper, but he didn't realize that I knew every board, every nail, and every secret of that land. He thought he was building a kingdom, but he was just setting the stage for his own ruin. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening, about 6 weeks into my exile. I was sitting on the cinder block steps of the trailer, watching a thunderstorm roll in over the pines when a dusty silver sedan pulled up. I didn't recognize the car at first, but when the door opened, out stepped Clara Whitlock. Clara was the town's oldest notary and a woman who had been my father's secretary. back when he ran the local mill in the 80s. She was in her late 60s now, sharp as a tack, and she had been the one who supposedly notarized the new will for Julian. I stood up, my jaw tight. "If you're here to tell me I need to move the trailer further from the road, Clara, you can save your breath." Clara didn't flinch. She walked right up to me, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel. She was carrying a heavy leather briefcase. "Don't be a fool, Silas Thorne," she said, her voice like gravel and honey. "I'm here because I'm the only person in this county who knows exactly how much of a snake your brother is." I stared at her, confused. "You signed that will, Clara. Your seal is on the document that ruined me." "I signed a document," she said, leaning against the side of the trailer. "But it wasn't the one your brother filed with the court. Julian came to me months ago, asking for help with your father's estate. He brought me a draft, told me it was what Elias wanted. I told him it looked fishy. Then, a week later, he came back with your father, or someone who looked a lot like him in the dark of a car, and asked me to notarize a signature on a property easement. I did. But Julian is a sloppy thief, Silas. He didn't realize I keep a personal log of every seal I press, and I record every transaction in my office for my own protection." I felt a jolt of electricity run down my spine. "You have proof?" "I have more than proof," Clara said, opening her briefcase. "I have the original draft he tried to get me to sign, the one with his handwritten notes in the margins about liquidating the North acreage. And I have something else. I've been helping Julian and Marcus Vane with their corporate filings for this new development. They think I'm on their side because I've been taking their checks. But every time they talk in my office, I leave the digital recorder in the pen cup running." We sat inside the cramped trailer for the next 4 hours. Clara played the recordings. I heard Julian's voice, arrogant and mocking, talking about how easy it was to fool the old man and how I was too simple-minded to fight back. I heard Marcus Vane discussing how they were going to bypass the environmental surveys by burying construction waste in the old quarry pond. They talked about the forgery like it was a joke. "Why are you helping me, Clara?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. She looked at me, and for a moment, I saw the young woman who had worked for my father 40 years ago. "Your father saved my house from foreclosure back in '08, Silas. He didn't ask for a dime back. He just told me to look out for his boys. I failed him by letting Julian pull that stunt in the car, but I'm not going to fail him now. We're going to give them exactly what they want, right up until the moment we take it all away." The next month was a blur of calculated movement. We didn't go to the police. Not yet. We knew Marcus Vane had the local deputies in his pocket. We needed something undeniable, a trap so airtight that not even the slickest lawyer in Georgia could wiggle out of it. We turned Clara's basement into a war room. It was filled with blueprints, bank statements, and maps of the Thorne property. "The key is the grand opening," Clara said, pointing to a flyer for the Thorne Estates Gala. "Julian has invited the governor, the press, and every major investor in the region. He wants to show off the first model home, the one he's building right on top of your old workshop site." I felt a pang of grief, but I pushed it down. "What do you need me to do?" "You're a master builder, Silas," she said, a wicked glint in her eye. "Julian commissioned a custom dining table for that model home. He wanted something authentic to show the investors. He tried to hire a firm out of Atlanta, but I suggested a local craftsman who works through a blind LLC I set up. He thinks he's getting a piece of Thorne history. He doesn't know he's buying a Trojan horse. For the next 3 weeks, I worked in a rented garage 3 towns over. I spent 16 hours a day on that table. It was a massive slab of ancient harp pine, reclaimed from an old barn. It was beautiful, but it was also a masterpiece of surveillance engineering. I hollowed out the thick pedestals, lining them with acoustic foam and high-definition microphones. I built a hidden compartment in the center of the table, triggered by a specific sequence of pressures on the wood grain that held a 4,000 pinhole camera. While I built the table, Clara was busy gathering the paper trail. She showed me how she'd tracked the money Marcus Vane was using to pay off the county inspectors. We spent nights going over the logistics. We needed Julian to admit to the forgery on camera in front of the very people he was trying to impress. "He's vain, Silas," Clara said during one of our late-night sessions. "He can't help himself. He loves to brag about how smart he is. We just have to give him the right audience." One afternoon, while I was sanding the tabletop, I found a small bottle of the specific blue ink my father used for his ledger. It had been in the bottom of my tool chest. I looked at the blue ink of justice Dad had mentioned in his letter. I realized then that Dad had known this might happen. He knew Julian's nature. He had left me the clues, but he'd also left me the responsibility to fight. For the first time in months, I felt dangerous. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the architect of a collapse. We spent days rehearsing. Clara played the role of Julian, and I practiced my responses. I had to be the broken brother who had finally accepted his fate. I had to lure him into the dining room of that model home. We coordinated with a contact Clara had at the State Bureau of Investigation, someone Julian hadn't managed to bribe yet. "The timing has to be perfect," Clara warned. "If you trigger the reveal too early, they'll destroy the evidence. If you wait too long, the investors' checks will clear and the land will be tied up in legal battles for a decade." I described the mechanism of the table to her. "The camera is angled perfectly. If he sits at the head of the table, like he always does, he'll catch every expression. The microphones are sensitive enough to hear a whisper from the kitchen. We also had to deal with the helper trap." Clara continued to act as Julian's confidant, even helping him clean up some of the forged documents, while secretly making copies of the originals before they were shredded. She was playing a dangerous game, risking her own license and reputation to stay close to him. "He trusts me because he thinks I'm greedy," she told me one night as we sat on her back porch. "He thinks everyone has a price. He can't imagine someone doing something just because it's right." "I don't know how I'll ever thank you, Clara," I said. She squeezed my hand. "Just make sure that table is the best thing you've ever built, Silas. It's not just furniture. It's a witness. The final week was the hardest." I had to watch from a distance as they finished the model home. I saw the signs go up. Thorne Estates, luxury living in the heart of Georgia. It felt like a knife in the gut to see my family name used to sell overpriced McMansions on land that should have been preserved. But I kept my head down. I delivered the table through a third-party moving company, making sure I was nowhere near the property when it arrived. Clara called me the night before the gala. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the tension. "The table is in place, Silas. Julian loves it. He's been bragging to Marcus about how he got some local idiot to build it for pennies on the dollar. The gala starts at 7 tomorrow night. The investors are coming for a private dinner at 8. I'll be there," I said. "In the shadows. Are you ready?" she asked. "I've been ready since the day they took my father's house," I replied. I spent the rest of the evening checking my equipment. I had a tablet synced to the cameras and microphones in the table. I sat in my darkened trailer, watching the test feed. The image was crystal clear. The grain of the heart pine looked like a map of the land itself. I could hear the wind whistling through the vents of the model home. I looked at the cedar jewelry box sitting on the small table next to my bed. I thought about the 4 generations of Thorns who had worked that land. I thought about the sweat, the calluses, and the pride. Julian thought he was throwing a party to celebrate his wealth. He didn't realize he was attending a funeral, the funeral of his own ambitions. As the sun began to set on the eve of the confrontation, the Georgia sky turned a deep, bruised purple. The air was heavy with the scent of rain and honeysuckle. I put on my best suit, the one I'd worn to Dad's funeral. I checked the tablet one last time. The house was lit up like a stage, glowing against the dark woods of the North 80. I could see the caterers moving around, the white tents being erected on the lawn. I drove my truck to the edge of the property, parking it deep in the tree line where it wouldn't be seen. I walked through the woods, following the paths I'd known since I was a boy. Every step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I reached the edge of the clearing and looked at the model home. It was a monstrosity of glass and faux stone, sitting right where my workshop used to be. I checked my watch. 7:45 p.m. The investors would be arriving soon. Julian and Marcus Vane were already inside, probably toasting their success with expensive bourbon. I settled into the shadows of a large oak tree, the tablet glowing faintly in my hand. I could see them through the large windows of the dining room. Julian was standing at the head of the table, his hand resting on the wood I had shaped. He looked triumphant. He looked invincible. I felt a cold, steady calm wash over me. The trap was set. Every wire was in place, every word would be recorded, and the blue ink of justice was finally ready to dry. I leaned back against the rough bark of the oak and waited for the night to begin. I stood there in the shadows of that old oak tree, the same one I used to climb when I was 10 years old. The tablet in my hand was a glowing window into a world that used to be mine, but now looked like a sterile, expensive museum. I could see Julian through the glass of the model home, standing at the head of the hard pine table I'd built with my own blood and sweat. He was holding a crystal glass of bourbon, laughing with a man in a charcoal suit. That was the governor's chief of staff. Julian was playing the part of the sophisticated Southern heir to perfection. But as I adjusted the brightness on the screen, the image suddenly stuttered. A jagged line of static tore through the picture, and the audio hummed with a high-pitched whine. I tapped the screen, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. "Come on, stay with me," I whispered. The feed cut to black, then flickered back with a grainy, low-resolution image that looked like a security tape from the 80s. I realized what was happening. Marcus Vane wasn't just a corrupt contractor. He was a paranoid one. He'd installed a signal jammer. He probably called it a privacy shield to the investors, a way to ensure their high-stakes conversations stayed within those four walls. It was a smart move for a man with a lot to hide, but it was a disaster for me. If I couldn't record the dinner, the trap was useless. The GBI agent Clara had contacted was waiting for a digital signal to move in. No signal, no arrest. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. I looked at the house, then back at the woods. I had 10 minutes before the main course was served, and the real talk began. I knew every inch of this land, and more importantly, I knew the bones of that house. Julian had built his masterpiece right on top of the foundation of my old workshop. He thought he'd erased my life, but he'd actually built his house on a skeleton he didn't understand. When I wired that workshop 20 years ago, I didn't just run lines to the barn. I'd buried a heavy-duty copper grounding cable that ran all the way to the old well house, 50 yards into the tree line. It was a redundant system, something Dad insisted on in case of lightning strikes. If I could get to that well house and tap into the old junction box, I could bypass the jammer by using the house's own internal wiring as an antenna. I started moving through the brush, staying low. My knees ached and my lungs burned, but I didn't slow down. I reached the well house, a small stone structure covered in ivy. I pulled away the vines, my fingers fumbling with the rusted latch. Inside, it smelled of damp earth and spiders. I found the junction box, the gray metal pitted with age. I pulled a small toolkit from my suit jacket tools I'd carried every day of my adult life. I had to work by the dim light of the tablet. I stripped the wires, my hands steady despite the adrenaline. I was bypassing the digital signal and feeding it directly into the copper line. It was old school tech meeting new school surveillance. I heard a twig snap outside. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked through the slats of the well house door. A security guard was walking the perimeter, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. He was headed right toward me. If he saw the door open, it was over. I'd be arrested for trespassing before I could say a word. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall, holding my breath. The light swept across the stone, lingering on the rusted latch. I could hear his boots on the gravel. He stopped. I heard the crackle of his radio. "Sector 4 clear," he muttered. He stood there for what felt like an hour, probably checking his phone. Then, he turned and started walking back toward the main house. I exhaled, a long, shaky breath. I turned back to the wires. I made the final connection and tapped the tablet. The screen blurred for a second, then snapped into crystal clear 4K. I could hear the clink of silverware and the low murmur of conversation. I'd done it. I'd turned the very foundation of the house against them. I didn't stay in the well house. I knew I had to be there in person for the final act. I made my way back toward the house, but I didn't go to the front door. I went to the side entrance, the one that led into the kitchen. I adjusted my tie, smoothed down my hair, and took a deep breath of the humid Georgia night. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was the reckoning. I stepped onto the porch, the wood feeling strange and hollow under my feet. It wasn't the solid oak I'd laid years ago. It was some composite material made to look like the real thing. That was Julian in a nutshell. I pushed the door open and walked in. The kitchen was a hive of activity. Caterers in white coats were plating expensive-looking hors d'oeuvres. No one looked at me. They just assumed I was another guest who'd lost his way. I walked through the swinging doors and into the dining room. The room was beautiful, I'll give it that. The lighting was soft, the wine was flowing, and the air smelled of roasted lamb and ambition. Julian was sitting at the head of the table, leaning back with a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. Marcus Vane was to his right, looking uncomfortable in a suit that was too tight around the neck. I walked right into the center of the room. The conversation didn't stop immediately. It tapered off, one person at a time, until the only sound was the hum of the air conditioner. Julian looked up, his smile freezing on his face. He didn't look scared yet. He just looked annoyed, like he'd found a cockroach in his soup. "Silas," Julian said, his voice dripping with a fake oily concern. "I thought we had an agreement. The restraining order was pretty clear about your boundaries." I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at the table. My table. I could see the faint glow of the pinhole camera in the grain of the wood, invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. "I'm not here to talk about boundaries, Julian," I said, my voice steady and loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm here to talk about the truth." Julian laughed, a sharp, barking sound. He looked around at the investors, spreading his hands wide. "I apologize for this, everyone. My brother has had a very difficult time coming to terms with our father's passing. He's been unwell. Silas, why don't you let Marcus show you to the door? We can talk about your truth tomorrow, when you're feeling more yourself." Marcus Vane stood up, his face darkening. He moved toward me, his shoulders hunched like a bull about to charge. "You heard the man, Silas. You're trespassing. Don't make me call the sheriff. You know he won't be as patient as your brother is." I stood my ground. "The sheriff is busy tonight, Marcus. And I think these folks would be interested to know that the man sitting at the head of this table is a common thief. He didn't inherit this land. He stole it." A murmur rippled through the room. The governor's man leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Julian's face went from annoyed to livid. He slammed his hand down on the table, the crystal glasses rattling. "That's enough," Julian shouted. "You're pathetic, Silas. You spent 20 years playing in the dirt while I made something of myself. You're jealous because Dad finally realized you weren't fit to run this legacy. He left it to me because I'm the only one who knows what it's worth. Now get out of my house before I have you hauled off in chains." "Your house?" I asked softly. "You haven't even paid for the lumber yet, Julian." And as for Dad, he knew exactly who you were. That's why he hid his final letter in the jewelry box he made for Mom, the one you missed when you were busy stripping the walls. Julian's eyes flickered for a split second. A tiny, almost imperceptible twitch of his jaw. He regained his composure quickly, but the crack was there. "The jewelry box?" Julian sneered. "You mean that old piece of junk? I threw that in a donation bin weeks ago. If you're basing your legal claim on a fairy tale about hidden compartments, you're even crazier than I thought. There is no other will. There is only the document notarized by Clara Whitlock and filed with the county. It's ironclad. It's legal. And it says you own nothing." I looked at Clara, who was sitting at the far end of the table, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She didn't look at me. She just sipped her water. "Is that right, Clara?" I asked. "Is the document Julian filed the same one you notarized?" Julian cut in before she could answer. "Don't drag her into your delusions, Silas. Clara is a professional. She's been helping us with the development because she sees the future. Unlike you, she doesn't live in a trailer dreaming about the past." "I'm not dreaming, Julian," I said. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my pocket. It was a copy of the letter I'd found. "This is Dad's handwriting, dated 5 days before he died. He says you were pressuring him. He says he didn't trust you. He says he left the shop and the North 80 to me." Julian stood up, walking toward me with a slow, predatory grace. He took the paper from my hand, glanced at it for 2 seconds, and then ripped it into 4 pieces. He let the scraps flutter to the floor like snow. "That proves nothing," Julian said, his voice a low hiss. "A handwritten note? In a court of law? It's garbage. It's the ramblings of a dying man who didn't know what day it was. I have the official seal. I have the witnesses. You have a handful of scrap paper and a grudge. Now, Marcus, get him out of here." Marcus grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. He started to pull me toward the door, but I didn't resist. I just looked at the investors. "Is this the kind of man you want to go into business with?" I asked him. "A man who would gaslight his own brother? A man who would forge a signature on his father's deathbed?" The governor's man cleared his throat. "Mr. Thorne, this is a private matter. We are here to discuss a multi-million-dollar development. If you have a legal dispute, take it to a judge. But right now, you are disrupting a very important evening." Julian smiled, a cold, victorious thin line. "You heard the man, Silas. You're small potatoes. You're a distraction. Nobody cares about your feelings. They care about the dirt and the dollars." Marcus shoved me toward the door, but I planted my feet. "Wait," I said. "If the will is so ironclad, Julian, then you won't mind explaining the environmental reports for the North Quarry Pond." Marcus' vein froze. His hand tightened on my arm, but his face went pale. He looked at Julian, his eyes wide with a sudden, sharp panic. "What are you talking about?" Julian snapped, but his voice was an octave higher than it had been. "I'm talking about the construction waste," I said. "The stuff Marcus has been dumping in the pond at night to avoid the disposal fees. The heavy metals. The chemicals. I've been watching the trucks, Julian, and I have the soil samples to prove it." The room went dead silent. The investors looked at each other. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. This was a liability. "He's lying," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking. "He's just trying to tank the deal. There's nothing in that pond but water and fish." "Then you won't mind if the state inspectors take a look tomorrow morning," I said. I've already sent them the GPS coordinates. And I've sent them the logs of the truck movements Marcus has been keeping in his office. Marcus turned on Julian, his face red with fury. You said he was handled. You said he was some broken-down drunk in a trailer who wouldn't be a problem. Shut up, Marcus. Julian hissed. He's bluffing. He doesn't have anything. I have more than you think, I said. I have the bank records, too. The ones showing the consulting fees you've been paying to the county inspectors. Clara was very helpful in tracking those down. Julian turned to Clara, his eyes bulging. Clara? What is he talking about? Clara Whitlock stood up slowly. She smoothed her skirt and looked Julian dead in the eye. He's talking about the fact that I've been recording every conversation in my office since this whole nightmare started. Julian. Including the one where you joked about how easy it was to guide. Dad's hand across the signature line while he was drugged up on morphine. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the lungs. Julian looked like he'd been struck by lightning. He looked at Clara, then at me, then at the table. You traitor, Julian whispered, his voice trembling. I paid you. I gave you a seat at the table. You gave me a seat at a table built on a lie, Julian, Clara said, her voice like ice. I worked for your father for 20 years. He was a good man. You're just a parasite wearing his name. Marcus Vane lunged toward Clara, his fist clenched. You old hag. I'll kill you. I stepped in front of her, but I didn't have to do anything. Two men in dark suits, who had been standing near the kitchen entrance, moved with a speed that told me they weren't caterers. They grabbed Marcus and slammed him against the wall. GBI, one of them said. Stay down, Mr. Vane. Julian backed away, his hands shaking. He looked at the investors, his face a mask of desperation. This is a setup. It's a conspiracy. My brother and this woman are trying to extort me. The will is real. I have the original right here. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. He held it up like a shield. See? It's all here. Everything is legal. Is it, Julian? I asked. Because the GBI has been listening to the feed from this table for the last hour. They heard you admit to throwing away the jewelry box. They heard you admit to pressuring Dad. And they heard Marcus admit to the illegal dumping. Julian looked down at the heart pine table. He looked at the wood grain, his eyes darting back and forth. He saw the tiny, dark speck of the camera lens. He let out a low, guttural moan, like a wounded animal. You built this, Julian whispered. You put a bug in the table. It's not a bug, Julian, I said. It's a witness. Every word you've said tonight has been broadcast directly to a judge's chambers. The investors, the bribes, the forgery. It's all on the record now. Julian's face twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable. The mask of the golden child was gone, replaced by a raw, naked greed. He looked at the investors, who were already standing up and moving toward the exit, trying to distance themselves from the wreckage. Wait! Julian screamed at them. Down, go! The deal is still good. We can fix this. I'll give you a bigger cut. Just don't leave. The governor's man didn't even look back. He just walked out the door, followed by the rest of the money. Julian was left standing in the middle of his model home, surrounded by cold lamb and the ruins of his life. He turned to me, his eyes full of a burning, psychotic hatred. You think you won? You think you're getting the farm back? I'll burn this place to the ground before I let you have it. I'll destroy everything Dad ever loved. He grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from the table and raised it over his head, lunging toward me. He looked like he was going to crack my skull open. I didn't move. I didn't have to. The GBI agent, a tall man named Sterling, stepped in and caught Julian's arm mid-swing. He twisted the decanter out of his hand and forced Julian's arms behind his back. "Julian Thorne, you're under arrest for forgery, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit environmental fraud," Agent Sterling said. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was the sweetest music I'd ever heard. It was a sharp metallic click that echoed through the room, signaling the end of the nightmare. Julian didn't fight anymore. He just slumped, his expensive suit wrinkling as he was forced down into a chair. "I hate you," Julian whispered, looking at the floor. "I've always hated you. Dad loved you more. He always looked at you like you were the one who mattered, just because you could carve a piece of wood." "He didn't love me more because of the wood, Julian," I said, leaning down so I could look him in the eye. "He loved me because I respected the land. You only ever saw it as something to be sold. You thought you were the smart one, but you forgot the most important rule of the shop." Julian looked up, his eyes red and watery. "What rule?" "Measure twice," I said. "Cut once. You were so busy cutting me out of your life that you forgot to measure the consequences." I turned away from him. I didn't want to look at him anymore. He wasn't my brother. He was just a man who'd lost a gamble. Marcus Vane was being led out the side door, cursing and shouting about how he was going to flip on Julian to save his own skin. Clara walked over to me, her hand resting on my shoulder. "It's over, Silas. The GBI has the original documents from my office. The state will be filing an injunction to stop the development tonight. The farm is safe." "Thank you, Clara," I said, my voice thick. "I don't know how I can ever repay you. Just keep the shop open," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "I've got an old cedar chest that needs some work, and I think Oakhaven could use a little more Thorne custom furniture and a little less luxury living." I walked out of the house and onto the lawn. The air was cooler now, the thunderstorm having passed. I looked out at the dark silhouette of the barn. It was still standing. The trees were still there. The land was still mine. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the cedar jewelry box. I ran my thumb over the smooth, hand-carved surface. I could almost feel my father's hands on mine. I'd lost everything for a while, my home, my name, my pride. But standing there in the Georgia night, I realized that those things can't be taken away by a piece of paper or a forged signature. They're built into the grain of your soul. I walked down the hill toward my truck, my steps light for the first time in months. I could hear the crickets in the tall grass and the wind in the pines. It was the sound of a legacy being restored. It was the sound of home. The marshal ratcheted the steel cuffs on Julian's wrists with a final, echoing snap. I reached into my pocket and felt the smooth, hand-carved grain of the cedar jewelry box, the weight of it grounding me to the earth. My father's voice finally fell silent in my head, replaced by the peace of the Georgia night. They say you reap what you sow. Sometimes justice comes fast, and sometimes it takes time. But one thing is certain: bad deeds never go unpunished. If you enjoyed the story, hit like. And if you believe justice was served, subscribe. Let's watch karma do its work together.